Hey guys, I hope you're having a good winter break. I hope you've had a Merry Christmas. I hope that you have a Happy New Year's as we approach New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, and we transition from 2020 to 2021. One thing that I shared in our devotional from last week is that this year I've kind of committed to journaling along with my scripture reading. I try to read scripture every day. I'm usually pretty good about it. But my goal for this year is to just write down the things that I'm thinking about as I read through scripture, so that a year from now I can look back on a year's worth of Bible study, just personal Bible study, and kind of reflect on what the Lord has taught me this year. I think that'll be a great thing, next December. So I hope that you'll come along with me in that. If you're not reading scripture every day, I think that you should be. I think it is incredibly beneficial to your spiritual life. And if you are reading scripture every day, I think that you should journal. I think that you should come along with me, and we'll kind of take this road together. But what I want to do this week is kind of share with you some notes that I kind of had written down from some scripture reading that I was doing actually a couple years ago that I've since kind of adapted. Initially it was kind of a sermon, and then I was like, maybe I'll do something with this later, and I decided to kind of adapt it into a nice kind of devotional for us this week. And so a lot of this is just me having read these verses and just my thoughts on them, and I just wanted to share that with you this week. And so this week what we're going to look at is James chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. I love the book of James. I think James has some great practical Christian wisdom, how to live your life day to day as a believer. And so what we're going to look at is James chapter 4. And what James is going to be telling us in these verses is that our relationship to the world and the size of our ego has a direct connection to our relationship with God. And so what I want for us to do first is to read 1 through 12 together, and then we're going to kind of break this down piece by piece. So looking at James chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, it says, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your own passions. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you suppose that it is to no purpose that the scripture says he yearns jealously over the Spirit that he has made to dwell in us? But he gives us more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is only one lawgiver and one judge, he who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? So what I want to do first is break down verses 1 through 3. And you can pause this video and reread those verses again as we kind of continue to break this down. And so what James is telling us in verses 1 through 3 is that the actions that we often condemn in others come from a place of incompleteness that we find within ourselves. and that these sins that we often can't understand or comprehend come from a very simple place of envy and desire, a place that we have all been before. We all have desires within us for more because we feel incomplete, and it drives us to do unspeakable things. Sins like murder, stealing, lying, adultery, and many more often don't just happen for no reason. They happen because we feel like there's something missing in our lives, and we're constantly trying to fill that void. What James says in these verses is that the reason that we don't have all the things that we need, the reason that we feel incomplete, is because we do not ask. Question for you guys. Have you ever wanted something that you later realized you didn't need? I feel like some of us may be experiencing that already. There may be some of us who we asked for something for Christmas that we were like, I really want this thing. And then, here we are a couple days after Christmas and we're like already done with that present, right? If you're not experiencing that this year, you probably have experienced it at least some point in your life. Scripture tells us that God is a good and loving Father, that He is a God who provides. A good father wants to provide for his children and keep them safe, but a good father also doesn't give his child every single thing that they ask for as soon as they ask for it. And when we think through why is that, why don't parents just give us everything we ask for as soon as we ask for it, we see that a good father wouldn't do this because his children would turn into spoiled brats who thought that they were entitled to everything that they wanted, and ultimately they would be poorly adjusted and unfunctional adults. When we understand this, we should understand that in the same way, God may not give us everything that we ask for as soon as we ask for it. We are called to have faith that God will always give us exactly what we need at the exact time that we need it. We need to have faith enough to ask and faith enough to wait on God and His perfect timing. To understand that there may be things that we think we need that we don't, and that God's not going to provide that. Or there may be things that we think we need right now that we really need later down the line. And at the same time, there may be things that we should be asking for, that we should be asking God to provide for us, but we're not praying, we're not asking. And so we don't have them because we haven't asked. The next thing that James tells us is that sometimes when we're asking for something and not receiving it, the reason is because we're not asking for the thing that we're asking for to glorify God. Rather, we're asking for it to glorify ourselves. So in thinking about, if you ever wanted something that you later realized you didn't need, we'll take that a step further. Have you ever prayed for something that you knew you didn't need? I know in my own life this is true. I remember as a kid, I would pray that God would make me turn out to be rich, that I would grow up and live in a mansion, that I would drive a Porsche. And so while none of these things are bad things, and we certainly shouldn't despise those who have more than us, I wasn't asking for those things so that I could glorify God in any way. I was asking for those things so that I could have them, so that I could live a life of comfort. And what I know now is that I don't need those things to be happy or content. In fact, I'm quite content without them. What James wants us to get here is that God only provides blessings to those who plan to use those blessings to honor and glorify His name. So as you ask for things in 2021, as we approach this new year, don't just think about what you need. Don't just think about what you want. Think about what you can do with the things that you're asking God to give you that will glorify God in return. So next, we're going to look at James chapter 4, verses 4 through 5. You can pause the video here and read those verses real quick. So the first thing that James says in these verses should be challenging and convicting for us. He says that friendship with the world is enmity towards God. Essentially what James is saying here is that if you have aligned yourself with the world, you have become an enemy of God. And James even goes so far as to call us adulterous for doing so. The example that he's using is saying that when we abandon God for the things of the world and the passions of the flesh, we are like a bad husband or wife who is cheating on our spouse, right? That's something that even non-Christians get upset about, that even non-Christians see as horrendous and wrong, and that us aligning ourselves with the world rather than God is as bad as that. Really, it's worse. What we see is that when we fall into that trap, we have abandoned a relationship which was beautiful, holy, and pure for something that provides momentary gratification and ultimately goes against what God has intended and which hinders our testimonies as Christians. However, I do think that there's an important distinction to make here as we talk about our relationship with God in relation to our relationship with the world. We need to understand that we are in this world, right? For at least the time being, we live on planet Earth. But we need to make sure that we are not of it. In order to do this, the first thing that we need to recognize is that even though heaven is our ultimate home, we have been put here for a purpose. Sometimes people read these verses about not being of the world and think that the solution is to simply disassociate from the world that we live in, to wall ourselves off. But let's not abandon or ignore our purpose of sharing the gospel with and loving others by separating ourselves completely from the rest of the world or using church as a means to hide from people who are different than us, right? That this idea of separating ourselves from the world does not mean that we don't share the gospel with other people, right? That we need to interact with people who are not saved so that they can hear the gospel. If Christians only ever talked to or associated with other Christians, no one would ever get saved. I'm standing here sharing the word with you today because of bold Christian men and women who were willing to share the gospel with me when I was living in defiance of and rebellion against God, right? So we do need to be careful, right, that we don't abandon God for the things of the world, right? But we should also be careful not to take that so far that we never interact with unsaved people, right? We need to be interacting with people who are not saved so that we can share the gospel with them. We need to be engaged in the world around us, aware of social issues, and at times, maybe even popular culture. In Acts 17, Paul's in Greece, and he's summoned to appear before a group called the Areopagus, which was a group of philosophers looking for new ideas. And what Paul does in front of the Areopagus is he uses their own poetry and their own art to explain God and the gospel to them. Understanding and being aware of the world that we live in is important, but we need to make sure that our first and our only loyalty is to God. We need to continually check ourselves to see whether or not we care more about the world than we do about God. Like James said, if we have become too close or too friendly with the world, we risk becoming enemies of God. At the same time, we need to make sure that we have not alienated those who need the gospel most in our lives by hiding our lights under a bushel, right? There's a balance here to what that looks like. And so last, but certainly not least, we're going to look at verses 6 through 12. This is what I like to call the good news part of this passage, right? So you can pause the video here and go read those verses again if you want, then we'll pick up. So the good news that James has for us in verses 6 through 12 is the good news of the grace of Jesus. What James is telling us is that if you've been living your life focused on the things of the world, if you've been cheating on God with the passions of the flesh, if you've been selfishly asking for things that you don't need, that you know you won't use to glorify the one who would answer that prayer, that it's not too late for you. Through his death on the cross, Jesus gives us grace upon grace upon grace. Just like in the story of the prodigal son in Luke 15, where a good father's son takes his money and abandons his father to live a life of sin, only to be welcomed back into the loving arms of his father when he hits rock bottom. Our Father in heaven loves us so much that he is willing to take us back into his arms if only we would receive him. Verses 11 and 12 tell us not to speak evil against our brothers. It's easy for us to condemn those living in the world, to condemn people who are living worldly lives, especially in a time when people's sin is so visible. However, what we are called to do is to be a light that would guide those living in sin to Jesus. At the same time, if we're living too much in the world, we should be careful not to assume that anyone who won't participate in, listen to, or watch something that we feel is okay is just a goody two-shoes or a weaker brother. Maybe we are the ones who need to change. And so as we think through these things, I think verses 7 through 10 are a good final charge for us as we close. And I'll read those again. It says, "Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you." And so each and every one of us should submit ourselves before the Lord and allow him to have every aspect of our life. As Christians, our greatest desire should be that we would have a deeper and more intimate relationship with Jesus, and that would happen for other people as well. What James tells us in these verses is that if we draw near to the Lord, he will draw near to us. And if we humble ourselves before him, he will exalt us. And so as we close and we think through these things this week, my encouragement for you as we approach this new year, right, as we leave 2020 behind us and we move into 2021, my hope for you is that you would draw near to God this year, right? That you would humble yourself, that you would abandon this kind of adulterous relationship with the world, and instead draw near to God so that he will draw near to you. I hope that this year will be a time for us to understand the greatness of God. One thing we talked about last week is that, this year's been tough in a lot of different ways. 2020 has not been easy for a lot of different people and in a lot of different ways. But as Christians, we should not make the mistake of thinking that God has abandoned us, or that God was surprised by this, or that God wasn't moving during these times, right? We ought to look back on 2020 and still see God's power and still see God's provision throughout this year. And I hope that as we do that at the close of 2020, that as we transition into this new year, that understanding all that God has done for us in this last year would be an encouragement for us as we draw near to God so that he'll draw near to us. So I hope that this was encouraging for you. I hope that this was helpful. And I'm looking forward to spending this next year with you, doing ministry, co-laboring for the gospel, and sharing what God is kind of showing me through Scripture with you. So thank you for being a part of Emmanuel Youth in 2020. And I really sincerely look forward to what God is going to do in this ministry in 2021. Have a good one. Bye.